Hey guys, what's up? Public here, back with another video about Shadow Priest. Recently, this week, we are getting buffed, specifically in AoE. Psychic Link's value is being adjusted. So today we're going to talk about, is this enough to make Shadow good inside of Mythic Plus, and kind of what the ramifications are for this change. So let's dive in. Okay, so first things first, coming December 19th and 20th, we have some class tuning here. Specifically today, we're talking about these very kind of small change, or just one-liner change for Shadow Priest. They're buffing up the Psychic Link coefficient from 15% up to 25%. This was what it was previously in a previous patch. Not quite back to its original value after the 10.1 rework, which I think was like 40%, but not as low as it was after the kind of knee-jerk nerfs from Season 2. So this doesn't have a whole lot of build implications, although we'll talk about that in a second. But it was drastically needed just because of how Shadow has kind of just been struggling, I feel like, to do relevant damage inside of keys, especially at the kind of lower end of things. Now, the thing is, I don't think this is necessarily going to fix all the problems, especially a lot of people are showing. It is definitely a buff. Looking at, 2 target, 3 target, you're getting like 4-6%, something like that. On Council, you can even get up to like 9% with this, which is good. So it's very much a good buff for static targets and consistent long fights. The problem is that's not so much a thing inside of dungeons, where like kind of dungeon overall average, you're going to see a kind of a wide swing here of anywhere between 2% increase on overall, all the way up to like maybe 7 or 8%. It really depends on the key that we're talking about. Obviously, buffing Psychic Link has no implication to single target whatsoever, which is still quite now a majority of your damage in keys, especially on tyrannical weeks. Over half the dungeon is just pure single target, which this does nothing for. And Shadow's fine in single target, but it's not like blowing things out of the water by any means. So what this means is, as you increase key level, this buff gets better. So this does kind of index it more towards the top end of things rather than the low end of things. And when I say that, that's relative to your group. So if you're at a key level that's really easy for you, with you and your whoever you're doing the key with, this buff won't seem that good. But if it's kind of classified as like a push key, or it's kind of like a progression key for your group, it will look better as you kind of climb up in key level, especially on fortified weeks. Psychic Link is just doing a larger portion of your damage because things are living longer and we have a bit more time, so we're not punished as much for that kind of setup. Similar cases to when like Void Eruption does well. So that being said, just to kind of dive into the numbers a little bit. So first thing I want to show up is, this is Tindral Sage Swift in the raid, which I know is kind of a weird example to bring up. But as you can see, definitely not Shadow's best boss. And this is mostly because we don't do any damage to the roots. And this is kind of bringing up what you're going to see a lot in low keys. We don't have as good of graphs, I think, for key levels in Mythic Plus. But this is kind of showing that, Shadow really struggles with kind of on-demand burst AoE, which is what is happening on Tindral Sage Swift, and what you're often going to see a lot of times in your kind of lower-end keys, especially when the whole group is, using all of their cooldowns. Shadow is going to really struggle there. And you're not going to see any gains there until you're going to kind of more longer-term stuff. And I think in general, the community's reacted pretty negatively overall to this. You can see, this is just looking at points, but Shadow's again kind of at the lower end of things. There's definitely still people are playing Shadow, but definitely not as much as you would expect normally. If we look at Radar.io kind of participation at M+20 and up, you see Shadow Priest is about 10,000, 2.2%. So just a lot less people playing Shadow than we've seen, especially compared to Season 2. From a playability perspective, it's among the worst out of all of these specs and classes. Even the Windwalkers get more popularity than Shadow. And if we actually bump this up to 25 and up, you see it's dropped out even more, where it's only 170 have done 25 and up keys. So not very popular. I think this is more or less to be expected. It's not going to be a meta spec even with this Psychic Link buff. Definitely not something anyone was expecting. But in terms of key viability, I think, which is what a lot of players are wondering about, you can absolutely still time any key at a +20 with any comp. And I think Shadow will be even better as we get into push keys. Not meta, but I think it'll still be competitive. The buff is at least helping, especially as you you kind of want to ride that progression wave, so to speak. When you're like easily 3-chesting keys, that means you're killing stuff so fast that Shadow's damage pattern can't shine. So it's kind of a weird chicken and egg problem where, like, you know, you don't know if you're doing good damage until you add enough things to deal damage with. But then it's hard because you're like, well, is this actually good or not? And I wanted to include this because I think it's interesting. There's so many tier lists out there, which I think is just kind of funny, but it is kind of showcasing there's this kind of soup, so to speak, of all of these specs down here that are just kind of average. And Shadow Priest is inside of this soup. Especially if you factor in, we still get Power Infusion if there's someone good with your group. I think it's still going to be a fine spec to do keys with, just not nearly going to be as powerful as some of these other things, especially some of the other ones that recently got buffed. So yeah, I don't, anticipate Shadow, eclipsing any of these specs necessarily, but I think these buffs are just going to help kind of rein it in so we're not, competing with Vengeance Demon Hunters as much on kind of mass AoE. So that's kind of what I would expect. Now, the important thing I wanted to highlight is what this is not going to fix. So, again, as I mentioned, not going to fix our burst AoE. Psychic Link still doesn't do that. When this was at 40%, Void Torrent and Mind Games gave us that burst, but this isn't going to fix that. It's also not fixing any kind of unsatisfying or frustrating moments the spec currently has with dot management. So if you've played the spec and you've been kind of frustrated with kind of relying on Shadow Crash to get your damage rolling, that problem is still here. They didn't change any of that. So for the most part, things are going to play the same. So other changes you can expect from this, in general, from like a talent perspective or a build perspective, we're seeing a less kind of reliance on Void Form, even at the top end level. I was simming everything at kind of like a plus 27 key level, and you're starting to see Dark Ascension just kind of crater Void Form kind of across the board. Not that Void Form I think is unplayable, but you're seeing enough gains out of Dark Ascension that it's making Void Form less desirable, particularly because Dark Ascension can apply more modifiers onto a single target to be able to spread them out with Psychic Link than Void Form's comparison, which is I just apply this kind of blanket modifier to everything that I'm hitting. And because Psychic Link doesn't double dip with any of that, it's going to prefer kind of tunneling in on one target better, which is what Dark Ascension just outclasses Void Eruption for completely. And there's nothing here of like buffing Void Bolt or anything else like that. So in general, I think you might still see Void Eruption in higher keys, particularly on Fortified weeks, but I actually would go as far to say that I think Dark Ascension is going to be kind of a cookie cutter build, way more so than it is right now in Keys on Live pre this change. Now, another kind of reason for that is while we're emphasizing this buff to Psychic Link, that means we're trying to really capitalize on this change and to even get numbers bigger than what I was talking about earlier. We want to pick things in our talent build that can get buffed by Psychic Link or that interact with Psychic Link, to be more specific. So there were quite a lot of people that were playing Void Form. A lot of the benefit of the Void Form build is it let you play Mind Flay, Screams of the Void, and kind of have this weird hybrid amount of damage where Psychic Link actually was quite a low part of your damage and you were kind of relying more on our dots to deal damage. But since our dots and Shadowy Apparitions, aside from Devouring Plague, aren't buffed by Psychic Link, what we're seeing in the kind of theoretical data from this change is we actually index back more towards our direct damage abilities that are buffed by Dark Ascension and then therefore work with Psychic Link. So what this means, tangentially, we were already seeing kind of a shift away from Screams of the Void. I think that's kind of cement, and what you're gonna see is more and more builds are gonna drop Screams of the Void, use Mastermind instead, and really double down on our direct damaging abilities, specifically Shadow Word Death. Kind of beefing up those modifiers and Mind Blast. So it's still kind of working out the tweaks. As you see, Sims running in the background. Look out for a new video coming out in the next day or so, kind of talking about specifically build changes and how you can change your builds inside of Mythic Plus as a Shadow Priest. But for now, that's all we have for these changes. I hope you enjoyed this video, and we'll see you in the next one. Thanks for watching.